Before discussing the current situation regarding the impact of globalization on English teaching in Vietnam, it is useful to first offer a variety of theories surrounding globalization and the differing impacts of these. Neoliberalism is a concept that asserts that competition between countries is inherently positive. Proponents of this theory cite competition as the driving force behind economic advancement, efficiency, and technological innovation. This market-driven focus allows businesses equity in and access to the world economy, which in turn leads to the advancement of society. World systems analysis claims that rather than creating a more equitable society, globalization has actually created an incredibly unequal one, in which the rich elite and powerful multinational corporations benefit the most. This hegemonic relationship is exploited by the richer countries as they exert dominance over the poorer nations in order to maintain the unequal relationship and influence how the poorer countries develop economically. World systems analysis views globalization as the spreading of universal cultural values such as autonomy, individual liberty, and democratic citizenship. This theory highlights how globalization seeks to influence ways of being and ways of thinking, which in turn promotes a shift in cultural values and practices. The lens of focus in this presentation will be neoliberalism, as the economic competitiveness and development have been key themes in the reform of policy and practice for improving English proficiency of Vietnam. Policy seen as instrumental in the development of Vietnam is Doi Moi. This landmark piece of legislation, introduced in 1986, shifted Vietnam away from a centralized government-subsidized economy to a market-driven economy focused on attracting foreign investment and growth for the private sector. Economic reform paved the way for modernization and participation on the global stage, a long-held ambition of the Vietnamese government post-Vietnam War. Doi Moi promoted Vietnam's participation in international trade, imports and exports, and attracted significant foreign investment and private sector growth. As a result of this, Vietnam experienced a period of rapid economic growth. Between 1991 and 1995, Vietnam's GDP grew by 8% a year on average, and then by an average of 7% between 1996 and 2006. For comparison, the United Kingdom's GDP at the same time grew 1.6 and 3.3% respectively. This placed Vietnam just behind China as the second fastest growing economy in Asia. Prior to the implementation of Doi Moi, foreign languages had a low status in Vietnam. However, due to the shift towards modernization and international participation, this created both the motive and the need for foreign language proficiency among Vietnamese citizens. Since the introduction of Doi Moi, the demand for foreign languages in Vietnam has expanded exponentially. English, in particular, is currently the most popular foreign language in Vietnam, with 86% of respondents of a nationwide survey selecting English as the foreign language that they study or have studied in the past. English is also a significant aspect of the Vietnamese curriculum, as students are required to start studying English from 8 years old all the way up to the tertiary level. And Tran further note that English is often used as the medium of instruction in private schools, international schools, and universities in Vietnam. English proficiency is a key component of the secondary school entrance exams, and up until 2025 was one of the 6 compulsory national examinations that students required in order to graduate from secondary school. Despite the prevalence of English teaching in Vietnam at all levels of education, a report by Education First, which studied the proficiency of 116 countries, ranked Vietnam 63rd. Vietnam was designated as having a low proficiency for English globally. However, within Asia they performed well, outperforming many other Asian countries such as China, Japan, and Cambodia. There have been a number of policy changes since the implementation of Doi Moi in an effort to bolster foreign language proficiency in Vietnam, and in doing so compete more effectively in the global economy. The 2005 education law was the first time that foreign language education was recognised by Vietnam, and according to Tran et al., was an explicit attempt by the Vietnamese government to recognise the role of English in their continued economic development and competitiveness. It was also the first document to open the possibility of some aspects of the curriculum being delivered in English to further bolster the English proficiency of students early on in their education. The 2006 General Education English curriculum was introduced to provide a framework for teachers to adhere to in an attempt to standardise content and help develop competent communication in English. There was particular focus on improving reading, writing, speaking and listening skills, and although the curriculum was updated in 2018, this was not very different from the original document, as there was still a strong focus on the same 4 skills. However, Huang noted that the updated curriculum also placed a renewed emphasis on phonics and language structure. The National Foreign Languages Project was an ambitious undertaking by the Ministry of Education and Training, with the overarching aim of having every Vietnamese student leave education with a good understanding of the English language. Improving the quality of the teaching that students received was described by Tran and Tanamura as the keystone to improving English instruction and therefore the ability of Vietnam to effectively engage internationally and compete in the global economy. As a result, 85% of the budget, which amounted to $446 million was allocated to teacher training, with the remaining 15% being allocated to updating teaching materials, textbooks, and assessment methods. Policy reform has inevitably influenced how English is taught in Vietnam in an effort to drive up English proficiency and, according to the Vietnamese government, therefore drive up economic development and competitiveness. Influenced in part by the extensive investment in teacher training by the National Foreign Languages Project, teaching methods have shifted from rote learning focused on language structure and phonetic competence to teaching students to communicate competently. Although there is still considerable emphasis on language structure and phonics, the focus has shifted onto students mastering reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills, which Nguyen notes aids in students learning to actually use the language rather than repeat a polished sentence from a textbook. English teaching has also had an increasingly significant place within the Vietnamese curriculum since the implementation of Doi Moi. English has gradually spread to all levels of the Vietnamese education system, from the lowest levels of primary school all the way up to the tertiary level. The amount of time that students spend studying English has also nearly doubled since Doi Moi, from 300 sessions in 1986 to 700 sessions in 2006, highlighting the recognition of the Vietnamese government on the importance of English proficiency in effectively competing in the global economy. English has also become a common medium of instruction for many schools across Vietnam. Although using English as the exclusive language of instruction is more common in private schools, international schools, and universities, Ngo and Tran asserted that it is becoming more frequent for students and teachers in schools to utilize both English and Vietnamese as a common way to communicate. Despite a variety of reforms to policy and practice, English teaching in Vietnam continues to experience challenges. There are significant concerns surrounding the teaching quality despite the introduction of teacher training and significant investment in the National Foreign Languages Project. Teaching quality in Vietnam, according to Huang, is still very varied and ultimately affects the ability of their students to communicate competently in English. There is still a fundamental disconnect between policy and implementation by institutions, as policy rhetoric dictates that students should be leaving education with good communicative competence in English. However, it appears that some institutions are still reliant on rote learning and language structure rather than balancing skills to ensure students can use the language functionally. The ambitious aims of the National Foreign Languages Project are still yet to be met. Despite the project expending half of its budget within the first 4 years of its conception, the project is widely considered by institutions as unrealistic and a failed attempt by the Ministry of Education to improve English proficiency through the upskilling of teachers. The project has attracted considerable criticism to the point where the chairman of the Ministry of Education and Training acknowledged that the project had failed to meet expectations and required major restructuring in order to achieve the targets set out originally. Globalization has impacted English teaching in Vietnam in a number of ways. The introduction of Doi Moi paved the way for an explosion in the need for English in Vietnam by shifting Vietnam away from an isolationist nation to a rapidly expanding competitor in the global economy. English was seen as a way for Vietnam to enhance its international participation on the world stage and in doing so enhance their ability to compete economically. However, despite efforts to reform policy and teaching practice, issues with teaching quality and a lack of overall professional development has ultimately hampered Vietnam's ability to improve English proficiency. This issue has become so significant that the chairman of the Ministry of Education acknowledges that English education in Vietnam is currently not meeting expectations and requires significant reform to rectify this. In conclusion, despite a concerted effort by Vietnam to improve English proficiency and in doing so enhance their ability to participate internationally and compete in the global economy, issues with teaching quality and implementation of policy in institutions has ultimately limited its success. This is the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening.